The Musk mansion was dazzling that Christmas Eve aglow with glittering lights and an air of opulence. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with the mingling voices of Silicon Valley's elite towering ice sculptures and live. Classical musicians adorned the space, but amidst all the splendor, Elon Musk sat at a corner table nursing his boredom with a glass of vintage wine. "You've done all," Elon quipped Richard. Sterling, a tech mogul with a penchant for stirring trouble. Mars reshaped transportation, even named your kid after a math equation, but you wouldn't dare step out of your comfort zone for it. Something truly outrageous. Elon raised an eyebrow. "Define outrageous." Richard, "My entire life is outrageous." "Then try something human." Richard goaded his grin. "Shark-like." "You wouldn't have a guts to marry someone unconventional." "Say someone." Like. He scanned the room and pointed solely at Melaine, a server weaving through the crowd with an unsteady tray of hors d'oeuvres. She was heavier than the women Elon usually surrounded himself with, her plain uniform clinging awkwardly to her frame as she avoided the judgmental glances of the wealthy guests. Elon followed Richard's gaze, his analytical mind immediately registering the challenge in his friend's tone. "Are you proposing I pick someone like her and marry them?" "I am," Richard said smugly. "By the end of the year, call it a test of courage." The surrounding group of elites chuckled, their laughter a mix of amusement and disbelief. Elon's eyes narrowed. "He being underestimated, even in just your serious, absolutely prove you're more than a genius with gadgets. Show us your human side." Elon leaned back, a slow smirk curling across his lips. "Done. You'll get your proof." As the group erupted in surprised cheers and jeers, Elon's gaze returned to Melaine. She was struggling to steady the tray, her cheeks flushed as a guest brushed past her without acknowledgement. A cruel snicker escaped from a nearby group as she stumbled, slightly catching herself just before spilling the contents. Elon downed his drink and stood. "Let's see how this goes." Crossing the room, he approached her with a deliberate calmness. "Excuse me," he said, his voice slicing through the din. Melaine looked up, startled, her eyes wary as she recognized him. "Do you have a moment?" Her brow furrowed. "I'm working, Mr. Musk." "Take a break." "I insist," Elon replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He gestured toward the quiet patio just beyond the French doors. "It's important." Melaine hesitated, then sat down her tray, casting a nervous glance around before following him outside. The crisp night air wrapped around them, contrasting with the warmth inside. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the glow of the mansion's lights. Elon turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" "Madeline," she replied, cautiously folding her arms against the cold. "Is there a problem?" "Not yet," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But I've got a proposition for you, one that could change your life." Interested minds' hands were trembling, a reaction not only to the frosty December air, but to the sheer absurdity of the situation. She rubbed her arms, trying to warm herself as Elon Musk stood before her, calm and composed, his sharp gaze unwavering. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low but firm. "Why would someone like you want to talk to me?" Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression inscrutable. "Why wouldn't I? You're clearly more interesting than anyone else in that room." Madeline raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Interesting? I'm a waitress trying not to drop trays. That's hardly a conversation starter, perhaps, but I'm a man who thrives on unpredictability." Elon said, his words deliberate as if he were testing her. "And I have a business proposition for you." Melaine couldn't help the laugh that bubbled out, though it carried no humor. "A business proposition with me? That's rich." Elon's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile. "I assure you I'm quite serious." Her laughter faded as she studied him, searching for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate joke. The sincerity in his tone was unnerving. "What kind of business proposition?" He didn't answer immediately, instead letting the silence stretch between them. The muffled sounds of the party inside, the clinking of glasses, bursts of laughter felt like they belled to another world. Finally, Elon spoke, his voice quieter now, almost conspiratorial. "How do you feel about marriage?" Melaine blinked. "Marriage?" She took a step back, her heels crunching on the snow-dusted patio. "Are you out of your mind?" "Not all," Elon replied smoothly, as if this were a perfectly ordinary Conversation: I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. You marry me for a short period, and in return, I'll ensure you're compensated beyond your wildest dreams. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She stared at him, her mind racing. Surely this was some bizarre prank. You're joking. I'm not. The steadiness of his gaze made her stomach twist. You don't even know me. I don't need to. This isn't about love or compatibility. It's about convenience. Elon folded his arms, leaning casually against the rail. Failing, you'll be helping me with something I need to prove, and in return, I'll help you with whatever you need: financial security, a new life, a clean slate, whatever you want. It's yours. Madeline shook her head, overwhelmed. This is insane. Why would you pick me? Because Elon said, his tone matter of fact. You're real, unlike the people I usually deal with. You don't put on a show. That's what I need right now. Her breath puffed out in white cloud as she tried to process his words. You're asking me to fake a marriage with you for money? Precisely. And what happens when it's over? What happens to me? You'll be free, he said simply, free to live your life however you choose, with the resources to do so. Mine's heart was pounding. This is crazy. Why would I agree to something like that? Elon leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Because I can give you something no one else can: security, opportunity, a way out of whatever struggles you're facing. Her immediate instinct was to refuse to tell him exactly where he could shove his proposal, but the words caught in her throat. The truth was, she was struggling to keep a roof over her head, struggling to provide for her teenage sister Daisy, who depended on her entirely, struggling to hold her head high in a world that seemed determined to keep her down. What's the catch? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. No catch, Elon said, his tone neutral. Just 6 months of your time, that's all I'm asking. And what do you get out of it? Elon hesitated just for a moment, and the line caught a flicker of something, pride or perhaps vulnerability in his expression. Let's just say I have a reputation to uphold. People expect me to do the impossible. This is a personal experiment. Her eyes narrowed. This sounds more like a game to you than a serious proposal. Call it whatever you want, he said with a shrug, but the offer stands. Malign wrapped her arms around herself, the cold biting through her thin uniform. I need time to think. You have 24 hours, Elon said, pulling a sleek business card from his pocket and holding out to her. My number's on there. Call me when you've made your decision. She stared at the card for a moment before reluctantly taking it. Her fingers brushed as briefly, and she felt a jolt, not from attraction, but from the sheer surrealness of the situation. This was Elon Musk, one of the richest men in the world, asking her to marry him for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. I don't even know what to say, she admitted. You don't have to say anything right now, Elon replied, stepping back. Just think about it. With that, he turned and walked back into the warmth of the mansion, leaving Malign alone on the snowy patio. She stood there for a long time, clutching the card in her hand, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. When her shift ended later that night, Malign drove home in silence, the business sea burning a hole in her pocket. The streets were quiet, blanketed in a thin layer of snow that sparkled under the streetlights. She parked in front of the small apartment building she shared with Daisy and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the cart inside. Daisy was asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled up to her chin. The small Christmas tree they decorated together stood in the corner, its lights twinkling faintly. Malign sat down at the kitchen table, resting her head in her hands. 6 months, that's all he wanted. But what would it mean for her, for Daisy, for the life they'd been trying so hard to build? Could she really trust Elon Musk to keep his promises? And even if she could, what would people think of her? The tabloids would have a field day. But then she thought about the rent that was overdue, the bills piling up on the counter, and the part-time job she worked that barely covered the essentials. She thought about Daisy's dream of going to college, a dream that seemed further out of reach with each passing day. Maybe this wasn't just about Elon proving something to his friends. Maybe, just maybe it was an opportunity, a strange, improbable, ridiculous opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless. Malign stared at the card for a long time before finally slipping it into her wallet. She didn't know what her decision would be, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same. The morning came with a sharp bite of winter air seeping through The gaps in the apartment's aging window frames. Melaine stood in the cramped kitchen cradling a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, the TV in the living room, drawn softly playing Christmas cartoons for Daisy, who lounged on the couch in her pajamas. "Mateline, you're staring at that thing like it's going to grow legs," Daisy called, her tone playful, but tinged with concern. She was pointing to the sleek black card resting on the kitchen counter. "What's that anyway?" "Something from work." Melaine hesitated, weighing how much she could or should tell her sister. "Just something weird that happened last night," she replied, trying to keep her voice casual. Daisy sat up, her curiosity piqued. "Weird? How did someone hit on you?" "Not exactly," Melaine muttered, turning her attention to the snow-dusted window. Daisy wasn't deterred. "Then what? Spill it." Madeline sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision she hadn't yet made. She turned to face Daisy, leaning against the counter. "Do you ever think about what you do if someone offered you a chance to change everything, like out of nowhere? Someone just hand you an escape route?" Daisy frowned, her youthful face softening into concern. "Is this about money? Are we in troubles?" "No," Melaine said, quickly walking over to sit beside her sister. "It's not that, it's just I got an offer, a really strange one, and I don't know what to do." Daisy leaned forward, her brown eyes wide. "What kind of offer?" Madeline hesitated, telling Daisy the whole truth felt impossible. It sounded too absurd, even to her own ears. "It's complicated," she said finally, "but if I say yes, it could mean a better life for us, a chance for you to go to college without worrying about loans or anything else." Daisy blinked, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "What kind of offer does that? It sounds sketchy." "It's not illegal or anything," Melaine reassured her, "just unconventional." "Unconventional? How?" Madeline hesitated again, then sighed. "It's marriage." Daisy's jaw dropped. "Marriage? You Maddie, you don't even date. Who are you supposed to?" "He marries." Melaine hesitated, then whispered, "Elon Musk." For a moment Daisy stared at her like she'd grown another head. Then she burst into laughter, clutching her stomach. Okay, good one. You almost had me." "I'm serious," Melaine said quietly. Daisy's laughter faded as she saw the tension in her sister's face. "Wait, you're not joking?" Madeline shook her head. "Why would Elon Musk want to marry you?" Daisy asked, her tone equal parts incredulous and defensive. "It's not a real marriage," Melaine explained. "It's more like a business deal. He needs someone for a short-term arrangement, and he's offering to take care of us in exchange." Daisy's expression turned stormy. "That's insane. You can't be serious." "Maddie, you deserve better than to be some guy's whatever this is, even if he's Elon Musk." Melaine reached out and took Daisy's hands in hers. "I know how it sounds, but Daisy, think about what this could mean for us. For you, you'd be able to go to college, get your degree, live the life you've always wanted. Isn't that worth considering?" Daisy's lip quivered, her anger giving way to tears. "You shouldn't have to do something like this just for me. It's not just for you," Madeline said softly. "It's for both of us, a chance to start over." The room fell silent, the hum of the TV filling the space between them. Finally Daisy wiped her eyes and nodded reluctantly. "If you think this is the right thing to do, I'll support you, but I don't have to like it." Melaine pulled her into a tight hug, her own tears threatening to spill. "I just want us to be okay, Daisy. That's all I've ever wanted." That evening Melaine sat on the edge of her bed, the black card clutched in her hand. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. It rang twice before a crisp, efficient voice answered. "Elon Musk, it's Melaine," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've made my decision." "And Elon?" asked, his tone neutral but attentive. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll marry you." There was a pause, and then Elon's voice came through, calm and steady. "Good. I'll have my legal team draft the contract. We'll meet tomorrow to discuss the details." "Wait," Melaine said, gripping the phone tightly. "Before we do this, I have conditions." Elon's interest was piqued. "Conditions?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I won't be humiliated if this is just a game to you. I'm not going to stand by and let people treat me like a joke. And I'm not some prop for your experiments. I'm a person, and I deserve respect." Elon was silent for a moment, and Madeline wondered if she'd overstepped, but when he spoke there was a trace of something almost like admiration in his tone. "Fair enough. Anything else?" "Just one more thing," she said. "This ends after 6 months. No extensions, no loopholes. After that we both walk away, agreed Elon, said I'll see you tomorrow, malign. He hung up before she could respond, leaving her staring at her phone, her heart pounding. She done it, she said yes. The next day Malign sat across from Elon in a sleek conference room. At one of his offices a team of lawyers was present. But Elon dismissed them after handing her the contract. Read it carefully. He said, I want you to be comfortable with the terms. Madeline did it as he asked, her eyes scanning the pages. The contract was as straightforward as he promised. 6 months of marriage, no physical intimacy. Required a generous financial settlement and a non-disclosure agreement to protect his privacy. When she finished, she looked up at him. This is thorough. I don't do things halfway, he replied. Malign took the pen he offered and signed her name at the bottom of the document. As she did, a strange sense of finality washed over her. She was no longer just Malign, the struggling waitress. For the next 6 months, she would be Mrs. Elon Musk. Elon stood and extended his hand. Welcome to the experiment. Malign shook his hand, her grip firm. Don't think I'll make this easy for you, he smirked. I wouldn't expect anything less. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned cold and gray, a stark contrast to the warmth of the holiday spirit that buzzed through the world outside. Malign sat in the corner of the spacious room she'd been given in Elon's sprawling mansion. It was larger than her entire apartment, and though it was beautifully decorated with soft linens and tasteful art, it felt alien and unwelcoming. A knock at the door startled her. Come in, she said. Her voice strained. A tall, composed woman in a charcoal suit stepped inside. Clipboard in hand, her sharp features softened slightly as she offered Malign a professional smile. Miss Aldred, I'm Vanessa. I'm here to help with today's arrangements. Madeline raised an eyebrow. Arrangements? The ceremony, Vanessa replied, gesturing toward the clock on the wall. Will begin pearly at 400 p.m. There's a team ready to assist with your hair and makeup, and your dress has been delivered to the dressing room. If you'd like, I can walk you through the itinerary. Malign opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The reality of what she'd agreed to was crashing down around her. In just a few hours, she would be standing in front of a room full of strangers, binding herself, albeit temporarily, to one of the most powerful men in the world. I'll be ready, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Vanessa nodded and left without further comment, leaving Malign alone with her thoughts. She turned to the full-length mirror in the corner, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed foreign, her eyes tired, her posture stiff. Was she really about to go through with this? By the time she stepped into the dressing room, Malign was bracing herself for the whirlwind of stylists and assistant bustling around her. A hairstylist fussed with her thick curls, pinning them into an elegant updo, while a makeup artist worked to conceal the dark circles under her eyes. The dress, a custom piece chosen by Elon's team, was surprisingly simple: a long-sleeved white gown with delicate lace accents and a flowing train. Breathe, the makeup artist said gently as she applied the finishing touches. You're going to look stunning. Malign gave her a weak smile, but her nerves were spiraling. She kept replaying the words she'd exchanged with Elon the day before. This isn't real. 6 months, and it's over. Still, the thought of stepping out in front of a room full of Elon's peers, people who would undoubtedly judge her, mock her, was enough to make her chest tighten. The ceremony itself was a small private affair held in one of the grand halls of Elon's estate. Despite its intimacy, the room was dazzling, with high ceilings, intricate chandeliers, and garlands of evergreen and twinkling lights adorning every surface. The scent of pine and cinnamon wafted through the air, mingling with the soft strains of a string quartet playing a classical rendition of Silent Night. As Malign stood in the doorway waiting for her cue to enter, she caught snippets of whispered conversations from the guests. Who is she? One woman murmured, her tone dripping with disdain. Probably some charity case, a man replied with a chuckle. Elon's always been a little eccentric. Mind's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She reminded herself of the promise she'd made to Daisy and to herself. She wouldn't let their opinions break her. When the doors opened and the quartet began a soft melody, she lifted her chin and stepped forward. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of awed judgments settling on her shoulders. The whispers grew louder, but she focused On Elon, who stood at the end of the aisle in a tailored black suit, his expression unreadable as she approached. He extended a hand to her. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, his voice low, enough that only she could hear. Madeline blinked momentarily, caught off guard. His words didn't carry the smugness she'd expected. Instead, they sounded genuine. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded and took his hand. The officiant began the ceremony, his deep voice echoing through the hall. Madeline barely registered the words, her mind racing with a mix of nerves and defiance. When it came time to exchange vows, Elon spoke with his characteristic confidence, his tone steady and composed. Madeline, in contrast, stumbled slightly over her words, but she managed to get through them without breaking. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Elon turned to her and offered a polite smile. "Shall we seal the deal?" he murmured, leaning in to press a light, almost performed kiss to her cheek. The guests applauded, though the sound was muted and polite, as if they weren't quite sure what to make of the union. Madeline could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her every move, every gesture. She wanted to scream to tell them that she wasn't the weak, desperate woman they undoubtedly thought she was, but instead, she held her head high and let Elon lead her out of the room. The reception was a subdued affair, more a business gathering than a celebration. Guests sipped champagne and nibbled on canopies as they mingled, their conversations filled with the language of mergers and investments. Madeline stayed by Elon's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm as he introduced her to a series of influential figures. "This is my wife, Madeline," he said, each time the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Lovely to meet you," she would reply, her smile polite but distant. The reactions were varied, some polite but dismissive, others barely masking their disdain. Only one person, an older woman with a kind smile, seemed genuinely interested in her. "You must be overwhelmed," the woman said as they chatted near the dessert table. "Stepping into a world like this can't be easy." Madeline offered a small smile. "Now it's an adjustment. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're handling it beautifully," the woman said, patting her arm gently. "Don't let them get to you." Mine's chest tightened at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said softly. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, Elon found her standing by one of the tall windows, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice quiet. Madeline glanced at him, surprised by the question. "I've been better," she admitted, "but I survived." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You did more than survive. You held your own." "Barely," she muttered, turning back to the window. "They all think I'm a joke." "Let them think what they want," Elon said, his tone firm. "They don't matter." Madeline frowned, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. "That's easy for you to say. You're Elon Musk. You could marry a cardboard cutout and still come out on top." To her surprise, he chuckled. "True, but I didn't marry a cardboard cutter. I married you, and I don't regret it." She turned to look at him, searching his face for any hint of mockery. Instead, she found only sincerity. It was disarming, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. "I'll keep my end of the bargain," Elon said, his gaze steady. "You'll have everything you need, but I meant what I said before. Don't make this easy for me. If anyone underestimates you, prove them wrong." Madeline studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I will." The days following the Christmas Eve wedding passed in a blur for Madeline. She adjusted to the grand, sprawling estate with its countless rooms, modern architecture, and staff who flitted about with practiced discretion. Despite their politeness, she could feel their eyes on her, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing down with every interaction. She couldn't tell if they were curious, skeptical, or outright disapproving of her presence, but it didn't matter. None of them said out loud. She spent most of her time alone, wandering through the mansion's endless corridors or sitting by the towering windows watching the snowfall. Her new life was nothing like she had imagined. There were no family dinners, no warm conversations, no shared laughter. It was cold, sterile, and lonely. Elon, meanwhile, was barely present. He spent his days in meetings, on calls, or locked in his private office, working on projects that seemed far more important to him than his new wife. The few times they crossed paths were brief and impersonal, a passing greeting in the hallway or a polite inquiry about her comfort. By the third day, Madeline had had enough. She found him in the expansive library, sitting at a sleek glass desk, Surrounded by stacks of books and papers, he was typing furiously on his laptop. Barely glancing up when she entered, Elon, she said, standing in the doorway. Mateline, he replied without looking at her, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She crossed her arms, stepping further into the room. We need to talk, I'm listening, he said, though his focus remained on the screen in front of him. Are you? She asked sharply, her tone cutting through the quiet that got his attention. He stopped typing and looked up, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. What's on your mind? Malayan took a deep breath, her hands curling into fists at her sides. This isn't working, he raised an eyebrow. The arrangement, it's only been a few days. Are you already reconsidering? I'm reconsidering the terms, she said, her voice firm. You promised me respect, but this doesn't feel respectful. You've treated me like a ghost since the day I moved in. We're supposed to be married, Elon. Even if it's fake, people will notice if we don't even speak to each other. Elon leaned back in his chair, studying her with a calculating gaze. You're right, he admitted. I've been preoccupied. Preoccupied, she repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. That's an understatement. I didn't sign up for this to be ignored. If you want this to work, and I mean really work, you need meet me halfway. Elon's lips pressed into a thin line. What exactly are you asking for, Malayan? I'm asking for you to treat me like a person, she said, her voice rising slightly. Not a placeholder, not an afterthought, a person. He regarded her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and nodded. Fair enough. I've been neglectful. I'll make an effort to be more present. Malayan blinked, caught off guard by his sudden agreement. That's it. What were you expecting? He asked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. A fight, she admitted. I don't see the point in fighting when you're right, he said simply. For a moment she didn't know how to respond. She had braced herself for an argument, for some kind of resistance, but his calm acceptance left her unsteady. Okay, she said finally, true to his word. Elon began making an effort to engage with her. He invited her to join him for breakfast in the sunlit dining room, where they exchanged polite conversation over coffee and pastries. He asked about her interests, her life before the marriage, her dreams for the future. Though his tone was casual, Malayan couldn't help but feel like she was being studied, as if she were another problem for him to solve. One morning, as they sat together at the long dining table, he asked her a question that caught her off guard. Why didn't you finish college? Malayan paused, her fork hovering over her plate. How do you know I didn't finish? I looked into your background, he said matter-of-factly. It's standard procedure. Her jaw tightened. I had to drop out, she said curtly. Money was tight, and my parents were gone. I had to take care of Daisy. L nodded, his expression thoughtful. You wanted to be a teacher, didn't you? Yes, she said, surprised that he remembered such a small detail. But that's not really an option anymore. Why not? She frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Because I'm too busy surviving, Elon. That doesn't leave much room for dreaming. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. What if it did? What's that supposed to mean? It means, he said, his tone even, that I can help you achieve that dream if you want it. This arrangement isn't just about me. I meant what I said. I want to help you. Malayan shook her head, her emotions wearing within her. You can't just fix everything with money, Elon. Life doesn't work that way, doesn't it? He asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. No, she snapped, it doesn't. And if you think throwing money at me is going to make up for everything, I'm lost. You're wrong. The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Elon sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You're right, he said quietly. Money doesn't fix everything, but it can help, and I'd like to help if you let me. Malayan stared at him, her chest tightening. There was something in his voice, something vulnerable and sincere, that made her. It was cold, sterile, and lonely. Elon, meanwhile, was barely present. He spent his days in meetings, on calls, or locked in his private office, working on projects that seemed far more important to him than his new wife. The few times they crossed paths were brief and impersonal, a passing greeting in the hallway or a polite inquiry about her comfort. By the third day, Malayan had had enough. She found him in the expansive library, sitting at a sleek glass desk. Surrounded by stacks of books and papers, he was typing furiously on his laptop. Barely glancing up when she entered, Elon, she said, standing in the doorway. Mateline, he replied without looking at her, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She crossed her arms, stepping further into the room. We need to talk, I'm listening, he said, though his focus remained on the screen in front of him. Are you? She asked sharply, her tone cutting through the quiet that got his attention. He stopped typing and looked up, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. What's on your mind? Malayan took a deep breath, her hands curling into fists at her sides. This isn't working, he raised an eyebrow. The arrangement, it's only been a few days. Are you already reconsidering? I'm reconsidering the terms, she said, her voice firm. You promised me respect, but this doesn't feel respectful. You've treated me like a ghost since the day I moved in. We're supposed to be married, Elon. Even if it's fake, people will notice if we don't even speak to each other. Elon leaned back in his chair, studying her with a calculating gaze. You're right, he admitted. I've been preoccupied. Preoccupied, she repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. That's an understatement. I didn't sign up for this to be ignored. If you want this to work, and I mean really work, you need meet me halfway. Elon's lips pressed into a thin line. What exactly are you asking for, Malayan? I'm asking for you to treat me like a person, she said, her voice rising slightly. Not a placeholder, not an afterthought, a person. He regarded her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and nodded. Fair enough. I've been neglectful. I'll make an effort to be more present. Malayan blinked, caught off guard by his sudden agreement. That's it. What were you expecting? He asked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. A fight, she admitted. I don't see the point in fighting when you're right, he said simply. For a moment she didn't know how to respond. She had braced herself for an argument, for some kind of resistance, but his calm acceptance left her unsteady. Okay, she said finally, true to his word. Elon began making an effort to engage with her. He invited her to join him for breakfast in the sunlit dining room, where they exchanged polite conversation over coffee and pastries. He asked about her interests, her life before the marriage, her dreams for the future. Though his tone was casual, Malayan couldn't help but feel like she was being studied, as if she were another problem for him to solve. One morning, as they sat together at the long dining table, he asked her a question that caught her off guard. Why didn't you finish college? Malayan paused, her fork hovering over her plate. How do you know I didn't finish? I looked into your background, he said matter-of-factly. It's standard procedure. Her jaw tightened. I had to drop out, she said curtly. Money was tight, and my parents were gone. I had to take care of Daisy. L nodded, his expression thoughtful. You wanted to be a teacher, didn't you? Yes, she said, surprised that he remembered such a small detail. But that's not really an option anymore. Why not? She frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Because I'm too busy surviving. Elon, that doesn't leave much room for dreaming. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. What if it did? What's that supposed to mean? It means, he said, his tone even, that I can help you achieve that dream if you want it. This arrangement isn't just about me. I meant what I said. I want to help you. Malayan shook her head, her emotions wearing within her. You can't just fix everything with money, Elon. Life doesn't work that way, doesn't it? He asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. No, she snapped, it doesn't. And if you think throwing money at me is going to make up for everything, I'm lost. You're wrong. The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Elon sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You're right, he said quietly. Money doesn't fix everything, but it can help, and I'd like to help if you let me. Malayan stared at him, her chest tightening. There was something in his voice, something vulnerable and sincere, that made her at him, her heart pounding more. How he hesitated, his gaze flickering back to hers. I don't know yet, but I want to figure out. The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for moments she let herself believe he meant it, but the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. I don't need you to figure me out, Elon, she said. I need you to see me, really see me, because if you can't do that, then this, whatever this is, doesn't mean anything. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Elon didn't respond immediately, but the look on his face told her he was listening. That night, as Malayan lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about everything she told him about being reduced to her weight, her struggles, her flaws. She thought about Daisy and the sacrifices she'd made to give her sister a better life. And she thought about Elon, with his walls and his contradictions, and his fleeting moments of vulnerability. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope not for a fairy tale ending, but for something real. Something worth fighting for, and though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let herself be anyone's joke ever again. The snowstorm began late in the evening, sweeping across the estate with fierce winds and heavy flakes that blanketed the ground in a thick, glittering white by morning. The world outside the mansion had transformed into a winter wonderland, silent and pristine inside. However, the storm between Elon and Aline was still brewing, unspoken but palpable. Malene sat at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out at the blinding snow. She hadn't seen Elon since their conversation in the library the night before, and her thoughts churned with questions she hadn't yet dared to ask. "Good morning," she startled, turning to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly disheveled, his tie loose around his neck, and for the first time he looked ordinary. "Human morning," she replied, her voice cooler than she intended. He walked over to the counter, poured himself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the opposite side of the island. "I've been thinking about what you said last night." Madeline raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. And you were right," he admitted, his tone quieter than usual. "I've spent so much of my life hiding behind my work, my accomplishments. It's easier than facing other things." She tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "What kind of things?" Elon hesitated, his gaze dropping to the swirling coffee in his mug. "My family, my childhood, the parts of me I don't like to talk about." Maline folded her arms, leaning forward slightly. "You can't just drop that and not explain." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. Call it survival," she said. He studied her for a moment before nodding, as if coming to a decision. "Fine, but if I'm going to do this, we might as well make it interesting." "Interesting how there's a greenhouse on the east side of the property," he said. "Meet me there in 20 minutes." The greenhouse was a startling contrast to the frozen landscape outside. Inside, the air was warm and humid, heavy with the scent of earth and greenery. Exotic plants climbed toward the glass ceiling, their leaves glistening with moisture. A winding stone path led to a small seating area near a bubbling fountain. Elon was already there when Madeline arrived, standing by the fountain and absently trailing his fingers through the water. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Why here?" she asked, gesturing to their surroundings. "I think better in places like this," he said. "It's quiet, isolated." She nodded, stepping closer. "I'm here talk." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You really don't hold back, do you?" "Not anymore," she replied. He took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to the F. "I grew up in South Africa, as you probably know. My family was complicated, to say the least. My father was a brilliant man, but he was also cruel, controlling. He had this way of making you feel small, no matter how hard you try to impress him." Mine's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his voice. "That sounds awful." It was, Elon admitted, "but it was also what pushed me to leave. I realized early on that the only way to escape a shadow was to create a life for myself. A life he couldn't control. That's why I started building things, creating things. It gave me a sense of power, of purpose." She studied him, her heart softening despite herself. "But it didn't make you happy?" "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't, because no matter how much I achieved, there was always this emptiness, like I was still that kid, trying to prove myself to someone who would never care." Madeline swallowed hard, her throat tight. "And your mother, was she different?" Elon's expression darkened. "She tried, she really did, but she was trapped in her own way. My father overshadowed everything, and eventually she just faded. By the time I left, it felt like I didn't have a family at all." The silence between them was heavy, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Madeline spoke, her voice soft. "I'm sorry, Elon. No one should have to go through that." He looked at her, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite place. "You don't need to feel sorry for me. I've made my choices, and I don't regret them." "But you're still running," she said quietly. He stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening. "Maybe, but at least I'm running forward." Maline stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. You can't outrun everything. Sooner or later you have to stop and face it. He let out a soft, bitter laugh. And what about you, malign? Where are you running from? Her breath caught in her throat. This isn't about me. Isn't it? He challenged. You said it yourself. You've been treated like a joke your whole life. But instead of fighting back, you built walls just as high as mine. You let the world tell you who you are. And now you're afraid to be anything else. The words hit her like slap. And for a moment she couldn't breathe. That's not fair, she said, her voice trembling. Maybe not, he said, but it's true. She turned away, tears stinging her eyes. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, he said, his voice softer now, enough to see that you're stronger than you think. But you're also scared, just like me. Malign clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. I'm not scared, she said, though the words fell hollow. Then prove it, he said, stepping closer. Prove to me and yourself that you're more than what they see. She turned back to him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and defiance. Fine, but only if you do the same. His lips quirked into a small, almost reluctant smile. Deal. They stayed in the greenhouse for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Malign shared stories of her childhood with Daisy, the struggles they'd faced after their parents' deaths, and the dreams she buried under the weight of responsibility. Elon, in turn, opened up about his journey to success, the sacrifices he made, and the regrets he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. By the time they left, the tension between them had shifted, replaced by something fragile but genuine. As they walked back to the mansion, Elon glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. You know, I wasn't expecting this when I proposed the arrangement. Neither was I, she admitted, but I'm glad it happened, he said. Madeline looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Why? Because for the first time in a long time, he said, I feel like I'm not running alone. The turning point came at a charity gala held in the opulent ballroom of a New York City hotel. The invitation had arrived a week earlier, bearing Elon's crisp signature. The event was ostensibly to raise funds for global education initiatives, but Malign quickly realized it was more about networking for the elite, a parade of wealth, power, and thinly veiled competition. Mine's palms were slick with sweat as she adjusted the neckline of her emerald green gown. It was a most expensive thing she had ever worn, tailored to perfection by a designer Elon's assistant had chosen. Despite the beauty of the dress, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. Relax, Elon said from beside her, his voice low. He looked effortlessly composed in a sharp black tuxedo, his presence commanding as they entered the ballroom. You'll be fine, Madeline shot him a sidelong glance, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Easy for you to say. You're not the one being judged like an exhibit at a museum. Elon smirked. Don't give them satisfaction if they see you sweat, they win. I didn't realize this was a competition, she muttered under her breath. It always is, he replied simply, steering her toward the crowd. As the evening wore on, Malign found herself wading through a sea of thinly veiled hostility and outright disdain. The whispers followed her wherever she went. Who is she? A new project of Elon. She doesn't exactly scream billionaire's wife, does she? She must be here for the money. Malign gritted her teeth, forcing a smile as she accepted yet another flu champagne from a passing server. Elon, meanwhile, seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the comments he navigated.